Hi, thanks for joining me. My name's Daniel Lovett, and this is Sozo Talk Radio. You're about to watch an interview I did with John MacMurray, who has recently written a book called A Spiritual Evolution. Forward written by William Paul Young, afterword written by Brad Jerzak. I just recently interviewed both of those guys on my Sozo Talk Radio. You can download that and check that out at sozotalkradio.com. And this first part, we discuss John MacMurray's connection to Donald Miller. Read a lot of his books, including Blue Like Jazz. So we talk about that. And we talk about his open table conference that he puts on with Baxter Kruger, an amazing theologian. I hope to have him on the show as well in the near future. And as well as William Paul Young. The three of them have been doing these open table conferences for a few years now. So June 7th through 9th, 2019 in Portland.
Welcome to Sozo Talk Radio.
Sozo Talk Radio.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Sozo Talk Radio. On the line, I have John MacMurray. He is I would say, a teacher, scholar, and nature photographer. At least that's how William Paul Young referred to you. And you have recently written a book called A Spiritual Evolution, which is an amazing, amazing book. We're going to be discussing some of this book and just about your testimony.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yes.
Glad to be with you.
Yes, I'm so delighted about this interview in particular. It's interesting because when I first heard your name recently and we got connected, I was like, John MacMurray, I know that name. Where do I know that from?
Yeah.
And then it dawned on me, Donald Miller. And because he was such an inspiration to me when I was like trying to recover from, religion that had done a number on me. Donald Miller was one of my dear friends. His writings, you wouldn't believe it. Just yesterday, my wife, she's at a thrift shop, and she just randomly decided to pick me up a copy of Blue Like Jazz because I'd given away my copy. So
that's fun. That's fun.
It'll be fun to read this again and get back into it. I remember reading this at a coffee shop and just like, it was bringing such comfort to my soul. I'm like on the verge of tears, just crying in public, basically. And then a friend walks up to me and says, "Hey, Daniel, how's it going?" I'm like, you just showed up at the exact wrong. Destroyed my enjoyment of this book, but I've really been enjoying this book. Oh my gosh, I just got to recommend this to all our listeners. Everybody, go pick up this. You can get it at spiritualevolution.com, and you can read the entire introduction to the book for free there.
Yep.
It's entitled "The Monster Under My Bed," if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's the name of the intro.
So
I was going to say, two things. One about Donald. First, I thought you were going to say the name, and you were going to say John MacMurray, the philosopher. So if you go like on Amazon and type in my name, his books will come up probably before mine do. Because he was actually a philosopher that had a lot of shaped. I don't know if you know the name T.F. Torrance or J.B. Torrance, the Torrance brothers from Scotland. Anyway, I thought that's what you were going to say. But then when you said Don, I was like, oh my gosh, Don, yeah. Like, because he's written like 6 books or whatever. And he lived with us for 4 years. And so he's like amazing. Family.
Now, how did that happen? How did this happen that Donald Miller came to live with you? I mean, I visited Portland. Let me tell you a really quick story about that. I visited Portland, and my friend and I were both, into reading Donald Miller, and we went to the church that Donald Miller attended. It was being held at a school at the time.
Yeah, Imago Dei.
Imago Dei. There you go.
That's the name of it. Yep.
And so while we were there, as the craziest thing happened, we went. We were sitting in the back, and I look over, and there's my uncle. And my uncle lives like 300 miles away in, near Spokane, Washington. That's where I grew up, in Spokane.
Really?
Yeah.
That's where my son lives.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
Yeah, he went to Whitworth, and now he's going to Gonzaga.
Whitworth. That was just up the road from where we lived, Whitworth. And I remember seeing you. You spoke there recently.
Yeah, actually, that was a little over a year ago. We
Oh,
were
okay.
at Whitworth and Gonzaga both. Paul and Baxter Kruger and I were speaking there.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's lovely. Yeah. So
Anyway, so you see
how
your
did Don?
uncle at Imago Day.
Oh yes, I see him, and I'm like, oh my gosh, and then we're like causing this scene in the back, because like find each other. Like I'm, traveling there from Wisconsin. We didn't tell each other we're gonna be there. He's just
Right.
there visiting that church because one of his son-in-laws was interested in checking out that church, and I was too. So we were there and we connected, had lunch, and it was cool. But yeah, I would
That's
really love
fun.
to hear the story about Donald Miller and how he came to
Okay.
live with you.
And I want to hear the story of how you got from Spokane to Wisconsin. So,
Yeah.
um, because I don't know if I think I'd rather live in the West, but that's just me. Anyway, Don, if you read the very first book that he published originally it was called Prayer in the Art of Volkswagen Maintenance,
Yes.
and he tells the story of he and a friend of his moving from Houston up to Portland. And so when he moved to Portland, he got a job, and he happened to work with a guy who had a publishing company, and the publishing company did mostly like homeschool books and stuff like that. A friend of mine worked there, and at the time was leading kind of a college / singles group, and we would meet in our home. I don't know, we'd have 50 kids show up and sit on the floor, and we would just talk. And Don started coming with my friend because he didn't really know anybody in Portland. So
Mm-hmm.
he started attending, and we became friends. And he was looking for a place to stay. And actually, he tells a story. I forget which book it's in. I walked into the kitchen, which is right behind me, and he was in the refrigerator. And I looked at him. He said, "Terry said I could make a sandwich." And I said, "Okay, you might as well live here then." So that's when he moved in. So
Wow.
we have a little apartment above the garage, like kind of an in-law thing,
Yeah.
is what they call it. And so he lived up there for about 4 years.
Yeah.
So
That's cool. He's
yeah,
he's got a beautiful heart, and I've read all of his writings. So, and in fact, I was reading your book and I came across this part about prejudice. You were talking about prejudice, and I'm like, and I was thinking two pages before you said it, I was thinking about the lifeboat analogy that
mm,
Don Miller, Donald Miller puts in one of his books, the Searching for God Knows What book. He
yeah,
talks about all that, and like, oh, he talks about the cool and beautiful club, and like, well, God really loves everybody. He doesn't leave anybody out. What this is, this whole thing. But then I read it in your book, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is probably where he got it from you or whatever, or maybe I don't know.
yeah. Well, we talked about it a lot. That whole analogy of the lifeboat. In growing up, the 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 gospel that I was told was rooted in the assumption that God was morally prejudiced toward us. So, in other words, if you're good, then he likes you, everything's okay. If you're not, then you've got problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So, and I go, wait a minute, he's not morally prejudiced. He's not
yeah,
prejudiced
absolutely
about
not.
anything. So,
Yeah, I love how well, even your this tagline on one of your websites, the Open Table Conference website, God is better than we imagine. Now tell me about your Open Table Conference coming to
okay.
Portland, June 7th through 9th. People can find that at opentableconference.com if they want to check it out. Tell us about that and what you hope to accomplish through that and how long that's been going on.
Sure. That started out of a thing that I do called Northwest School of Theology, which started in 2007. And that originally, Daniel, was just my attempt at trying to help people grow deeper. Back in the day, when people wanted to go deeper, the recommendation was go to Bible college or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, what if we just did something where it was kind of an intensive, invited people to take part in that. So I started doing that, and I actually did that over for some friends who live in Slovenia over in Europe. We put one together, and I remember flying home from Slovenia thinking, like, I don't know anybody who's doing this in the States. Not that it's not being done, but I don't know of anybody in our area that's doing something like this. So that was 2007. Right before we did it, I'm trying to remember the exact timeline here, but because it's kind of cool how this ties together. Right before I did it, Paul Young published The Shack in May of 2007. Our first school of theology was September. And so it had only been out for 4 months. He literally was selling them out of the trunk of his car. Mm-hmm. And here's a great marketing thing. The only way you could get the book besides knowing Paul and getting him out of the trunk of his car was from a website. And the only way you could get the website, it was in the back of the book. So it's like, okay, how am I going to know about a website from a book that I'm trying to get when the only place I can find out about the website's in the book? And so I had a guy give it to me. I was speaking at a Sunday school class at church. And afterwards he came up to me and he said, "Have you heard about this book?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, it's a local guy." And he says, "I think you'd really like it." He says, "You sound like it." Mm-hmm. And I kind of shrugged and went, "Okay, whatever." A week later, I go back, teach the class again. He comes up afterwards and he has the book in his hand, The Shack. And this is September. So it's like literally 4 months. It's been out for 4 months. Mm-hmm. And he insists that I take it with him. So I take it with me right after the first school of theology. So like right after that, I did school of theology, and then I went on a photo trip because I do photography. That's my vocation. It's my job. And I took it with me. And I had an experience very much like yours with Blue Lake Jazz, in that I was in Moab, Utah, and I had gotten up super early, shot the sunrise out in Arches National Park, had come back, gone back to sleep for about an hour, and then went to, it's called the Moab Brewery. It's the only brew pub in the town. And it was 11 o'clock and they had just opened. So I went over I hadn't had breakfast or lunch. So I went over to get lunch. And I was walking in and I remembered, oh yeah, like that book. So I ran back to the car and I got the book. And I sat there and read the whole thing in one sitting. Cried several times in the restaurant, publicly. But I didn't know anybody there. I didn't have any friends walk up to me and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" But I sat there till like almost six in the evening. I read the whole book. And so that was 2007. So the very next school of theology, I invited Paul to speak at it. So before he comes and speaks at it, we had started meeting regularly because we lived near each other. We didn't know each other, but we lived like 15 minutes apart. But we had started meeting and talking. And I was teaching part-time at a school called Multnomah University. It used to be called Multnomah Bible College. And I was teaching there, and I'd had him come and teach in the classes and stuff. And so we met up one time. I'm trying to remember what it was. It wasn't far, but I remember him asking me, had I ever heard of a guy named Baxter Kruger? And I said, no. And he says, well, he loves the Gospel of John like you do. And I go, really? Mm-hmm. So he says, oh, I got a book of his. I want you to read it. I want you to tell me what you think. So he ran out to the car, got a book by Baxter Kruger. It was called Across All Worlds. And it's a thin paperback. I took it home and read it. And like it was blowing my circuits apart. I was going, you got to be kidding. Like, so there was part of me that was going, yes, yes, yes. And then the whole intellectual academic side was like, well, what about kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So there was this kind of struggle going on. So long story short, he ends up doing a conference with Baxter because the Shack at that point, this is now not quite a year later, this is 2008, and it's probably like April, and it's starting to take off. Like it's starting to, they're starting to fly off the shelves, so to speak. And so they do this conference together in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi. And Paul says, I said, I'd love to meet him. You want to go? And I go, yeah. So he calls Baxter and says, yeah, bring him. So I come down and I met Baxter. We stayed up till 3 a.m. talking about the Gospel of John. Paul fell asleep in the chair. And we became great friends. And so the two of them came to SOT in September of 2008. And we started doing that regularly, a couple times a year. So out of that, we said, because I limit SOT to 20 people, because that's the best. I found that that's a really, I won't say the best, but it's a really good environment for dialogue and conversation, people to get to know each other, to be honest and open in a safe place. And it gives them personal access to these guys to talk with them and get to know them. So we basically said, you know, if we do this, even if we did this 10 times a year, that's 200 people that we would talk to. And I personally, I don't care. That's fine with me. But they're like, well, at the time, Baxter in 2012 wrote a book called The Shack Revisited, where he talks about the theology of the shack. Mm-hmm. And right before that, in November of 2011, Paul wrote his second book called Crossroads. So those two things were coming out, and they said, you know, we think that there's just going to be a ton of people that are going to want to be a part of this conversation. We should do something bigger. And I said no probably 15 times, and then finally said, and I don't even know what changed my mind, other than I think the Spirit tapped me on the head probably 15 times, this time harder. And I went, okay. So we came up with the Open Table Conference. The idea of the Open Table was that it's a multifaceted metaphor, but the idea being the table is, there's a place for everybody at the table, regardless of who you are, what your background is, what you believe, or anything like that. And you belong there. And it's the Lord's table. Kind of like Rublev's icon, you know, there's a place at the table for you. And no question is off limits. No question is stupid or dumb or anything like that. And so the idea is that we don't want this to just be kind of a lecture thing, because it's not like we feel like we have an agenda. It's like we want to talk about this, and specifically about Jesus Christ, because he's more beautiful than we ever thought he was. So we want to set the table and then actually enter into dialogue and conversation with you, as opposed to just giving you information, because this is about relationship. This isn't about education.
Right.
Not that education's bad, but it's only a means to, or part of a means to. Mm-hmm. So that was the idea of Open Table. And we did our first ones in 2013, and they were great. I lost a boatload of money because I didn't know what I was doing. But we've worked that out. And so we've been doing them now for this will be the 7th year. And we do one every year in Portland, because Paul and I live here. Because at the beginning, we said, what makes Open Table Open Table? Well, what we said was, we'll guarantee that regardless of who else comes, Paul Young, Baxter Kruger, and John MacMurray will be there. And then whoever else, that's great. That's just going to make the conversation better. But those 3 guys will be there, because we're kind of going to do this together. And they said, great. So we have been.
Yeah, and this year you have Brad Jerzak coming,
yeah,
who I interviewed, one of my more recent interviews, and Kenneth Tanner, who I'm just connecting with per your recommendation through your book. I kept seeing his name, and I was like, oh, Kenneth Tanner. And then I remembered, oh my gosh, Kenneth Tanner, he's coming to speak at your Open Table Conference. So that's amazing.
And others as well. But yeah, those guys are all coming. Yeah, if you get a chance, I think as you begin to read, Kenneth is I hesitate to use the word priest. I guess he would say that. He's Father Kenneth. He's in the Anglican Church, and so he wears his collar everywhere. But he's just a great guy, and he writes so beautifully and effortlessly. You're gonna like him. You're gonna like him. He's just a great guy.
Yeah. So I would love to read something by him, because actually, as we were in conversation, you mentioned that your chapter 14 about Jesus, the epic story, the drama of Jesus, was written with kind of Kenneth's writing inspiration in mind. And I was like mesmerized during chapter 14. I was just lost in it, and it was just
Oh,
beautiful.
thanks.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because the actual writing of the book, that's another whole story on its own. But I knew that I wanted to write, and basically, because a lot of the book, Daniel, is I'm not telling people, I'm not trying to teach them what to believe or anything like that. It's really a lot of questions. These were my questions, and these questions led me, number one, to recognize that the story or the narrative that I was in was no longer tenable. It wasn't sustainable. I was trying to follow, trust, love a God who was very much like a monster to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this love-fear relationship, and not fear in a good sense of awe, but fear and like, I'm scared to death of you. So that made it really hard to trust. So the book is just really a lot of questions that I asked and thinking through those. And so when I got to the end, I knew I wanted to talk about the incarnation, because the incarnation is the thing that changed everything for me, which sounds really weird coming from a Bible teacher who's been in this story, in the evangelical story, for decades. But I had some real misunderstandings about the incarnation, and in just coming to terms with that in a better way, I knew I wanted to say, okay, this is where my journey's brought me. So here's where I'm at, okay? And
Mm-hmm.
so I struggled for, oh gosh, a really long time. Like, how am I going to write this chapter? And I didn't know Kenneth. And I saw a post that he wrote on Facebook. And I read it and I went, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. And so I responded to it, not much anything. And then I was maybe a week or two later, I saw another post, and it too was beautiful. And it was about, I don't even remember what it was about, but there's a line that I actually quote in chapter 14, because he hadn't published it anywhere. It was only on Facebook. So I wrote him and said, may I have your permission to quote you? But I don't know where you wrote this. I don't have a source. He goes, well, I just put it in the post. I said, well, do I have your permission? He said, yeah. And I told him, I said, I want you to know that the Spirit just tapped me on the shoulder and said, this is how you've got to write this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll find, and I think this is what you were alluding to. Chapter 14 is much more poetic in its style and the way I'm trying to write, because I'm trying to get past the words to our emotion, to our gut level relationship with this person. In a phrase, what's captured my heart is beauty. And it's the beauty of who God is. And that's captured my heart. And so I didn't want to communicate like, okay, so here's where I'm at, just as kind of this theological position.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to communicate it in the beauty of how it had gripped me. And when I read Kenneth, I went, that's it. I've got to do this poetically. So that's how I say he inspired the way I wrote chapter 14.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And
Thanks.
and really where we've come from. I mean, looking back, like because I've been through a lot of this journey that you describe in your book, that the shack really helped me along in my journey. You know, as I responded to that, I was realizing, oh my gosh, this is exposing that I've, you know, I grew up in the Christian church, but it seemed there was this theology that existed that taught that, you know, behind the curtain, there's this monster God, that the God of wrath, that Jesus came to intercede for us, you know, on behalf of, you know, to good cop, bad cop kind of thing. And that's, yeah, I was like, Jesus, you're okay. I'll pray to Jesus. I know you tell us to pray to your Father, but I don't know about him. Don't leave me in the room with him, you know, alone.
Yep.
You're okay, Jesus, though. And really, you know, even Paul Young, he was asked. This is funny, when he was asked by a reporter, so what do you have to say about these famous atheists and their position? And he responds, I agree with them. The God that they say don't exist, I don't believe exists either, and
Yeah.
it's just so interesting. So Brad Jerzak, in his afterward, he quotes Kenneth Tanner and says, who says, apostasy can be a good thing. To hear the gospel, we first need to abandon the false gospels we were taught. Unlike the ancients who had to unlearn the worship of idols, contemporary persons must reject the distorted projections of Christ with which we were raised, and the Father too, for that matter. Thank you so much for joining us on this first part of this interview with John MacMurray and his book, A Spiritual Evolution. I would highly encourage you to pick up a copy at spiritualevolution.com. This book, I believe, is just going to be revolutionary to bringing the Reformation to the church that's needed. And it's such a valuable book. Like this, I cannot stress to you enough. Like this is worth way more than the $15 you'll spend at the website to get it. It's going to be a valuable addition to your life and a blessing to whoever you give it to. So, also, be sure to subscribe to stay tuned for next installments of this interview, and to support this channel. Please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And you can support Sozo Talk Radio at patreon.com/reflectworship. Thank you.